Hi, and welcome to Birth Through the Veil. I'm Melissa Camrudin, the host and creator of this podcast. Today I've invited Aubrey Shepherd of Calibrated Birth to talk about waterbirth and the role of pain in labor. I was first introduced to Aubrey's work through a fellow birthkeeper who told me she wasn't supporting waterbirths anymore and directed me toward Aubrey's content. Waterbirth is the holy grail of homebirth. It's a religious dogma. It's so ingrained in the culture, homebirth almost equals waterbirth. Rejecting waterbirth sounded insane to me, like fear-mongering, skewed facts taken out of context, but I had to look, and now I can't look away. I love nuanced conversation and hot takes that make me squirm as my beliefs are questioned and sometimes crushed. And Aubrey delivers on this front every time.
What it always comes back to in these conversations is how could waterbirth be unsafe? And what people need to understand is for the women who are trying to have a physiological birth, we just have different rules. So I guess that's kind of the statement that can cover all of these topics, really. You know, when we're talking about birth choices and we're talking about, finding appropriate information for learning birth education, and of course, understanding the importance of the risks involved with waterbirth, and not just waterbirth, but of pain evasion tactics in general. We can call them pain relief options, but that to me is fluffy language designed to downplay what these things actually do to your physiology. Because everybody likes to throw that word around: physiology, natural, uh, free birth, all of these things being connected, the hormonal blueprint. But does anybody actually know what that means and how to support it? That's that's what we have to get to. Because if that's the kind of birth that you want, there are certain things that you need to make sure are going to be in place. You have to be prepared. You have to know how to support it. You have to know how to support the hormones that you're wanting to allow this production to take place in, right? So it's interesting for some people to want to make the decision to birth at home without a medical professional. Like that's a completely valid choice. That's what I did. That's what a lot of people do. But we have to make that choice for a specific reason. Like we have to be intentional. I say that all the time. Every choice you make has to be intentional because there's going to be so much about this journey that's going to be really unpleasant. And that's a lot of the part of my birth education and my prep with my clients is this is going to be the worst and the best day of your life, pretty much. And postpartum will probably be even worse. And not so much just because of the pain and how scary it is, but because everyone else around you, more often than not, is not going to be supportive. And they're not going to give you good advice. And everything you do as the first generation of someone birthing like this and parenting like this, everything you do, you're going to have to come up against struggle and conflict. So it's that when we talk about transfers and stuff like that, seemingly people transferring for no reason, it just got too hard for them. That's all it is. You make a decision that you don't want to do this anymore, and so then you don't. That's it. But the immaturity comes in when people have to make up a story. Well, the baby just didn't move down, or I just had a narrow pelvis, or my bladder was full, or there was meconium, or all the things that we see in self-directed birth. I don't like the term free birth, of course, um, but they weren't fully prepared for it, and a lot of it is, you can learn and you can educate on all these things, and everybody always wants me to give them the list of dangers. Like, just tell me what to look out for. And I always tell them it's not going to be like that. No matter how much we talk about this, no matter how much work you do, when you go into labor, I mean, heck, even when you get pregnant, you're going to come up against things that are unknown and scary. And even if you had previously heard about it and understood it, when it's happening to you, it's so much more intense. And especially if there's pain involved with that, like with labor, right? And healing postpartum. And breastfeeding is another big one that sends women to the hospital because
Yeah.
you're doing something in a way that is just so completely contradictory to people in modern life. So yeah, it's really difficult, but that's why people need to understand how important this is to understand supporting the hormones, supporting your body to do what it's trying to do to keep yourself safe and to keep your baby safe. And part of that is understanding how dangerous water birth is. And
Mhm.
it's I understand if it's something that it's like new to you and you've kind of heard about it because most of us when we get into the birth world in birth work or even just birthing our own babies at home, water birth is something that you come up against. Like it's something you learn about early on. And it's one of those things where I think everybody thinks at first, like, what if the baby drowns? Or, just little
Mhm.
tiny ignorant things that you might think, like that kind of seems weird. But then the culture around it just really hones in on you. And they always say, well, that's because the baby has the cord and they're in water for 9 months. And, then you're like, okay, I get it. And then you put it down. And then most birth workers don't look at it anymore. They just think, oh, it's
Yep.
just adoption and it's supernatural. And most of the babies don't cry. So nobody really looks into it. And then when you start seeing the women who don't have the midwives there to kind of clean up the mess, they start having all these problems. And they have
Yeah.
nowhere to go to because I have actually witnessed these mothers try to go on these larger platforms that are pro water birth and they try to tell them their stories and what happened to them. And they just get immediately shut down, just like an OBGYN would to a woman who was complaining about her experience in the hospital. Oh, it couldn't have been the water. Sometimes these things just happen. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. It's just blaming everything but what is actually true. And I'm sure you have understood that after working with women for so long, it doesn't matter if they're a first time mom. They have such a deep intuition, and they always know deep down, even if they can't find the words for it, they know. And I've had so many women come to me and they're like, I looked at your research and I looked into this and all the facts. And I have to say, it's crazy that I didn't know any of this stuff, but I knew it
Mhm.
was the water that caused my son to have these problems. I knew it was the water that made my daughter pass away. I knew it was
Mhm.
the water that made my contractions slow down or speed up. It's all of those things are important. And so, that's why I started the Stories of Women Homebirth study so that we can just gather all of these stories, good and the bad, and really analyze it like that instead of a clinical study, instead of, these
Yeah.
parameters here. We're just going to listen to women's stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that. I want to bring that up again because that's fascinating. When I was thinking about our conversation and I was like what was it that made this a hard, like unpalatable to me when I first heard it? And I'm thinking, and what were my assumptions before? Like the first thing, like I said, I never questioned it. After I like got into the holistic birth world, and things I would say. So if you spoke to someone who was sort of like a hospital birth obstetrician bent, and they'd be like, of course, like how could you be born in water? That's totally dangerous. And then the things I would say would be babies are calmer when they come out of water, right? Which sounds really nice. And they, like you said, they are living in water. They haven't breathed air yet. So if they come out in the water, they're not going to breathe. They're they're just going to be in the same environment again. They still are attached to the placenta and the cord, which is their lifeline. That's where they're getting their oxygen. More women will stay home if they water birth because it's nature's epidural. Um, and interestingly, when I'm looking at these, I feel like these are things we are not going to disagree with, really. Like it is like nature's epidural, and that's the that's one of the problems, right? That it's like nature's
Exactly.
epidural. And I'd like to talk about that as well, like the role of pain in birth, because a lot of, even as a doula for many years, a big part of my role was talking to women about how to like avoid pain, how to yeah, avoid the sensations, or like distract yourself from the sensations, or numb out from the sensations that birth is going to bring. And in my last birth, which was like the least, it was still painful. I don't know, the least, not traumatizing is not the right word. Anyway, I don't know what to call it, but my way was like to head like straight into the pain, like right in there and ask
Hmm.
for more. And that felt so much less like birth was happening at me. Like I was the driver of birth now, and it was in no way less painful. That's not what happened. A little sidetracked there, but yeah, those are the pieces that I assumed. And so can we talk about some of those assumptions that people have, or in whatever way you'd like to take it? I don't know if it would be better to take it from like a physiology perspective first about
Yeah,
why.
because you're right. You get through it by not being the victim anymore. And I know that's a word that's thrown around a lot too,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But there needs to be no judgment around that. I get this a lot whenever I use certain words and language. I get a very emotional response from people, and I have to
Mm-hmm.
remind them, we don't need to attach shame to this. Like I was deep into my victimhood the first time I gave birth. I spent a long time fighting it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's something that you have to physically go through to understand it. We can do a lot of prep, but I still tell all of my first time moms it's going to be new to you. It's going to feel foreign. It's going to feel like you don't know what you're doing. And that's the biggest thing. And I think it- I think a lot of the women aren't prepared for the pain and the intensity. But also, I don't think they're prepared for having to actively do labor, actively be a part of it and
Mm-hmm.
participate in it. And that's what the pain is calling you to do. It's calling your attention. It doesn't mean something is wrong. And so that trips up a lot of people because we go through our life
Mm-hmm.
believing that pain is something to avoid. And I try to describe it like, well, if you broke or sprained your ankle and it wasn't painful at all, what would you continue doing, right? You'd continue walking
Mm-hmm.
on it, but it needs to heal, so it hurts, so you don't walk on it. It's all pain is doing is it's a messenger. It's not the enemy. And we can absolutely make things more painful, because you've talked to women too, I'm sure, about how they have women who've been through completely unmedicated natural births that were painful. But a lot of them will consider the cervical exams they have received in previous births to be more painful than that. It's a different kind of
Mm-hmm.
pain. It really is. And it's an
Yeah.
intensity that you can work with. And there's
Mm-hmm.
there's also this constant chasing of pain-free birth too. I think that is a huge issue. And so when
Yeah.
we constantly try to chase a pain-free birth, we think that the pain is a problem. We think that we're doing something wrong. So, you can absolutely make labor longer. Most first-time moms will make labor longer because they're fighting it. Um, and again, I say that with no judgment. It's so hard not to fight it. Like, it's so hard not to fight it. I have to actively give my clients tips, teach them how to work with the contractions, teach them when and how to push. It's not something that's just
Mm-hmm.
going to come to you. So there are a lot of free birth stories, I think, that end in transfer after days of labor because the mother is just completely left alone. She doesn't know what to do, and she's in so much pain, and she's so lost. And the people around her are just, putting hot towels on her back and giving her drinks and telling her she's doing a great job, and her body was made for this. Most women need more help than that. And it's trying to trying to just decide I'm going to birth outside of the hospital or without midwives, and it's going to be natural and physiological is just it's a lie, and it's setting up women to fail. That's one of the main reasons why
Yeah.
I like to use a different terminology for self-directed birth versus free birth, because we really need to get people to understand the intention behind it.
I suppose like the idea, like what they say, the free birth rhetoric is like babies just come out eventually. And like, I suppose that's true.
Right.
They would just, in
They
most
will.
cases, just come out eventually. But like you said, like knowing how to get out of your own way, so helpful. Like, how long do
Yeah.
you want it to go on for? Like, how long do you want to move through this? And how much suffering would you like there to be before you do get out of your own way and the baby does just come out?
And how long can the baby last? That's the biggest
Right.
thing there that
Yeah.
no free birth educators are saying. They are saying things like it can take as long as it needs to.
Mm.
That midwives even will actively do things to slow the birth down, saying sometimes we need to slow the birth down. Like, okay,
Yeah.
nobody knows outside of looking at heart decels, which we know that's not foolproof. Nobody knows what condition that baby is in, how long they have.
Mm-hmm.
So it's better to just streamline it. If you're not in excruciating pain with the contractions never ceasing, typically that means the baby is doing all right. But if you've got intense, pain that does not let up no matter what you do, even when you're surrendering, that baby needs to come out now. And so that's where we get into my education on the urgent baby.
Mm-hmm.
Because the pain in birth and everything, I try to treat it like a math problem to describe to people so that they don't think there was something wrong. Because I've experienced a birth where it was very painful, and long because I was fighting it. And then once I stopped fighting it, all the pain went away. And I had a painless birth the last half because I didn't have an urgent baby. The second time I surrendered very early, as soon as it got intense. But the pain never let up and it was more intense because he was an urgent baby and I had a placental abruption. He did not have very long. So, it's like framing it like that really helps people to understand
Yes.
what this is all about because it's not we need to stop trying to chasing an experience, with the
Yeah.
candles and the birth pool and is we're breathing the baby out and everything. It needs to be less about that. I tell people have that in postpartum. That needs to be part of your postpartum with community and food and candles and treat that the way it needs to be. When you're giving birth,
Mm-hmm.
just pretend that you're on an acid trip and you got food poisoning. Like, where do you want to do that? You kind of want to probably do that alone, naked in the bathroom, undisturbed. Just get the baby out. Like, it's going to be amazing, but we really don't need to overcomplicate it because that's when we introduce risk. And like I say, the baby will eventually come out. They always come out, but they don't always come out alive. And that's a very harsh
Mm-hmm.
reality that we have to talk about because there are so many babies who are dying because of this. And parents need to be prepared. They need to be prepared for this. They also need to be prepared for how easily you can disturb the hormonal matrix. I mean, even if you forego the water and the counter pressure and all the things, the husband's presence could still cause things to hold up. I don't know how many times I've seen this happen. I mean, sometimes I have to tell people to leave. Sometimes the mom doesn't even know. That's the other thing. The dads are kind of put into an interesting position where they're trying to give their wife autonomy and they're trying to do everything that she wants, but she's in so much pain and she's in another realm and she doesn't know what's going on. And so she can't really help him. And so, that's why a lot of what I do is I talk to the dads and teach them how to support them. And a lot of the times, as soon as they leave, everything just picks up really fast. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's something that everybody that goes through it is still really shocked. They always say to me, I can't believe I was so hung up on that. I can't believe that was stalling things. And so, when something like your husband or your toddler can completely stall labor and cause a complication, we really need to look again about hiring strangers and getting into birth pools and putting TENS units on our backs and stuff like that. So, especially if you're not doing monitoring, because we understand how
Yeah.
disruptive monitoring is. It's no longer a physiological birth. But if you're going to mess with it,
Yeah.
using pain relief tactics and having strangers, observance is a disruption. So if you're going to disrupt it, you might as well monitor it. So that's what
You're
I
probably
always say. If
best
you're
to
going to have a
monitor it.
physiological birth, yes, if you're going to have a physiological birth, then support your physiology. If you're not going to support your physiology, please have monitoring. Like
So
that
this is where like the
is
interesting nuance is, right? With like just water birth as an example, but there's all these ways we try to mitigate pain in our births. But water
right,
birth as an intervention, to consider it an intervention. And if you're going to use it, consider it like using Pitocin or an epidural, in which case we would be
yes,
monitored by a professional who is there to mitigate the harm that it can cause. So like there's some nice
right,
things with it. Maybe you chill out, maybe like, but it's likely to cause some harm. So that's
right,
probably not something you should do alone. That's the piece that's interesting to me in our community of free birth or birth without a medical professional present or with anyone present is there's more considerations you have to take. One is educate your intuition. Like there's this thought that like we all just have the intuition there. And I think we do have beautiful intuition, but there's something like there's more to it. You got to educate your intuition so it knows where to go. And then
yes,
think about this is the piece I hadn't thought of. So I had a free birth, water birth one before knowing about this, and yeah, and I can see how the water contributed to so many things in my birth that I thought were just going the way they were going, like a very very long birth. that was like start and stop, a lot of start and stop. And it turned out fine. My baby's happy and healthy, and I'm happy and healthy, and there was no excess bleeding. But in retrospect, I can just see how water was not supportive of that birth at all. Even, I remember, this is crazy to me now, but I remember thinking, when he's born, I just want to, or the baby, I didn't know it was a boy, I just want to look at him under the water before I take him out. Like, I just want to be chill there and let him sit in the water. And as soon as he was born, he flipped over and I could see his face, and his mouth was open like he was crying under the water. And I was like, and it just scared me, and I pulled him up right away. And he was like real quiet and like didn't cry. And I was like, oh, he's so calm. It's so beautiful. I mean, I didn't really think very much more of that. And then on my next baby, I had a baby, a land baby. And that baby, as soon as her head popped out, she was crying. And I was like, I bet you he was too. I bet you, like, my babies are born and my placenta comes out pretty quickly after, usually. And I think he was like ready to breathe, like right when his head popped out. But he was in water, and there was just, and it turned out all right for him. He was like a full-term healthy baby. But that's a big risk I didn't know I was taking, with no monitoring, just being there, my husband in the pool.
Exactly. And most babies are fine, but that's what I have to tell everybody. Well, most babies born in the hospital are fine too. We're a very resilient species. But, you know, there are plenty of babies that were not fine from these things. And, you know, it kind of goes back to the whole trying to have an experience. A lot of women who choose free birth are trying to choose it because they've had bad experiences, or they don't want to have the bad experience in the hospital. So, I mean, I get it, but it's a very selfish reason. And you're not thinking about another core component of this, which is the baby. The water birth is, there's no benefits to the baby when it comes to water birth. There's no benefits to a TENS unit. There's no benefits to the baby when it comes to that stuff. It's all for the mother and her comfort. And to me, it's just, in my opinion, it's unethical, personally. But I understand other people that want to make those choices for themselves, and to them, like I said, I just implore them to get monitoring. Like, please, at the very least, monitor if you're going to use any of these things. I mean, you're going to be monitored with an epidural, like we said. But you know, there's a really big ethical thing when it comes to water birth, and it's just, I feel like when you're choosing to have a physiological birth, you're also kind of choosing a lot of other things. Like, you're choosing to do attachment parenting, you're choosing to co-sleep, you're choosing to breastfeed. Not very many women are going to choose to have a physiological birth and then forego all those things. You know, formula feed, bassinet, you know, daycare. That's kind of not really, you know, as you probably notice, you know, when you have a free birth baby versus a cesarean baby, you feel a completely different type of attachment to them. Your nervous systems are actually linked and attached. It's very different from a lot of people that are having their babies in more of a mainstream way. And there's so much more self-sacrifice when it comes to this, you know, being a mother and going through that pain and all that whole process, and giving yourself over to the baby. Um, and you know, it happens when you're not ready. You know, the labor will just start, and it's just kind of trying to use pain relief, in my opinion, is just people saying, I don't want to, I'm not ready. It's for me, it's just all fear. You know, this whole process is meant to turn you into a mother. It's meant to make you stronger. It's meant to get you ready for the real work, which is raising this new human being. And just trying to act like it's just one day and trying to make it into this comfy, pleasant experience, I feel like is a huge disservice to the child and the entire purpose of them coming here. And then from just a straight up physical standpoint, the birth is meant to be their physical transition to pulmonary respiration. The entire process from the very beginning is getting them ready to breathe air. So they expect when their head comes out that they're going to be in air. And so, you know, like the recent podcast on birthing instincts with Barbara, she's like the queen bee of the water birth. She said plainly, you know, because she had a question from, I think it's Blythe, is that her name? But yeah, she birthing bliss. I can't remember. Anyway, just
Mhm.
scratch that. I don't know the names of all these people. But she asked a question that a lot of people had, and she said a lot of people are noticing that these water birth babies have lower APGARs.
Mm.
They even had to make a new APGAR score. Cordelia Ennings, she made the Aqua APGAR because water birth babies take so much longer to come around. And she just said plainly, well, yeah, because the land baby has a head start. It's like, well, that's all you need to know right there. I mean, they all
Yeah.
still support it, but they just said it plainly. Yeah, the water birth baby can't breathe. So, you're putting a barrier in the way for your own comfort.
So if I'm just gonna like be myself of like a year ago who'd never heard of this, and the questions I was thinking as I was reading your stuff, and I was talking to this birth worker who's like, no water births ever. Okay, so if I were like, but babies are so much more chill. Water babies are like little Buddha babies, and they're so calm. Like, how could this be bad for babies? What's the like
I would,
physiological answer to that?
well, I would tell them, have you ever seen a hypoxic baby when they're born? They're very calm. Like you don't want a calm baby. That's not it's one of those it's comfy, fluffy words. Is it calm or is it oxygen deprived? It's oxygen deprived.
Mm-hmm.
And every baby will go through some oxygen deprivation through labor. I mean, that's what the breaks and the contractions are for, and that's why we have vasopressin, most amazing hormone that helps to, regulate your fluid balance. And as yours increases throughout labor, it will increase in the baby, and that helps the baby to recover from this oxygen deprivation. It makes it far less likely for them to develop a severe brain injury from hypoxia if labor goes on for a long time. So there's already a lot of fail safes in place. And then when you get in the water, you make vasopressin go down. And when it goes down in you, it goes down in the baby because your body is trying to regulate fluid balance for labor. But then you get in the water. So then suddenly it has to do a totally different physiological response that conflicts with what it's trying to do to birth the baby. So that's the main thing that people need to understand about it. Like, understand that what you're doing is conflicting with the process. That in and of itself should make you pause,
Mm-hmm.
let alone all the other complications when we're talking about water pressure, the diving reflex.
Okay, what about mammalian dive reflex? There's this thought that like until the baby's face hits air, it's never going to try to breathe anyway, and it's got this cord and placenta, and it's been using that for 9 months, and it's fine.
Yeah, yet there are babies that have had autopsies where they found pool water in their lungs. So
Mm.
that's another thing that Barbara Harper still puts her foot down and says that they cannot take a breath. And this was interesting
Mm.
too in the podcast that I saw where Dr. Stu, even that kind of made him pause. He was like, whoa, because he's seen a lot of breech births, right? He's like the breech guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he's
Yeah.
like, well, if a breech baby is in distress or they're stimulated too much or something, they will gasp. So what do you say to that? And she just kind of brushed it off and changed the subject. And it's like, we all know babies who have gasped water. They've gasped water, meconium, it's a real thing. It happens. And it happens when the
Yeah.
mammalian diving reflex is overridden. And the mammalian diving reflex is overridden when there's any anomalies or if the baby is in distress, which can happen at
Mm-hmm.
any time in labor, especially if the labor is going on long and you're messing with the physiology, right?
Yeah.
So you're just kind of banking on the fact that you're going to have a smooth labor and that the baby is going to be resilient enough to handle these changes and these complications. You're putting more hurdles in the way of the baby. And you're just hoping that they're going to be all right, or you have an attendant that can resuscitate them. Because that's the other thing, too. Have monitoring if you're going to do that, but also know that it's not a guarantee. So, I personally know a lot of midwives who just won't do it anymore. They're like, I'm tired of resuscitating babies. I'm tired of transfers. So no more water birth.
I guess the piece that I find compelling in that is like I had the baby who could sustain it and was fine. I have pictures of me holding him like pretty super blue and chill, like on my chest. And then he came around and it was okay. And what I didn't understand is that piece of I was putting more barriers in place. Like I was
Mhm.
lengthening the birth canal. I was like doing these things to the baby which he could handle, my baby could handle, but had I known that, like I wouldn't do anything that would make it more challenging.
Right.
had I known that was a piece. Okay, so why do water birth babies take longer to transition? So we know we have this aqua apgar score. So this isn't even like a secret. This isn't like you're like blowing the
Hmm.
lid off something. It's like everybody knows there's an aqua apgar score,
Yeah.
which must mean it's different. So what is it that's causing them to take longer to transition?
Yeah, because everything is delayed, because we're messing with the process and we're creating more barriers. We're lowering the vasopressin from the hydrostatic pressure of the water, right? Because it lowers in the mother and it lowers in the baby. So it's making it harder for every single time you have a contraction. That's about 70 pounds of pressure on the baby. And they don't get any oxygen during your contractions. So it's during the breaks that they're able to be reoxygenated. And they only have a certain amount of time before that placenta is going to detach. That's the other thing. I still have midwives that say that placenta will keep them pumped full of oxygenated blood through the entire time, and it will only detach and stop once that baby is expelled. I'm like, do you understand placental abruption at all?
Yeah.
Because, come on, like, no. And what about babies that are born with a white cord? I've seen so many in my practice, so many born with a white cord. And a lot of them are fine because they were born just in time, but that placenta was done. Those were all long labors. So clearly, there is a period of time where eventually the baby needs to be born because they have already had the placental transfusion and it's going to be done. And when you're in the water, like I said, you're having that vasopressin decrease, you're making it harder for them to recover. So we talk about Pitocin all the time, right? That it's kind of like dunking your head underwater, and then when you come up, when you're about to take a breath, you get dunked again. That's what it's like being on Pitocin for the baby. The water does a similar thing. It's not as extreme, but it does a similar thing. And that it's not causing your contractions to be so intense, but it's making it harder for them to recover from the oxygen deprivation of the contractions. Then you have the issue of the water temperature. So if the water is too hot or too cold, that causes physiological changes to the mother and the baby as well. That I go through all the list of how those change. And those are also from Cornelia Enning, as well as other midwives who have seen this in practice as well. She lists all of these. She believes firmly that Americans have their water too hot. And I've witnessed that as well. Most free births, they're going to have like bath water. Um, for a I don't want to say the word safe water birth, but to try to mitigate the risk of water temperature, it needs to be between 86 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's any colder or hotter than that, you're going to increase more risks that are not related to the hydrostatic pressure. So, and then then you have the baby being expelled into the water. So the act of them coming down and coming out of you is all like it's what's the word? It's all part of their transition. So, when we talk about getting a baby to breathe, resuscitating the baby, helping them transition, that begins with their head being squeezed out. And then you bring the baby up to your chest and you're talking to the baby and you're rubbing the baby and the baby is naked. They're not immediately covered in a towel and warmed up. They need to feel the air. They need to hear the sounds and see everybody. And they need to be, I don't want to say startled, but essentially they need to understand that they are now in the world. They are now going to be separate from their mother physically and they need to breathe on their own. And they do need to claim their life. So it's not something that should just be this little cradled thing where we go into warm water and then immediately into a warm towel and we're not allowed to cry. And they wonder why it takes days and days and days to get all that fluid up out of their lungs. Babies should come out alert, pink, crying, obviously not frantic, but a lot of mothers I've had to tell them, like rub their feet, rub their back, talk to them, blow air on their face, suck the fluid out of their nose and mouth. That is something very instinctual that all primates will do. They will put their mouth over the baby's nose and mouth and suck out. And I've seen free birth educators advocate against this, saying that it's a
Yeah.
disturbance. I'm like, well, baboons do this. I did that, and I didn't even
Yeah.
plan on it in my second birth
Yeah.
because I was so undisturbed. So, I've had first time mothers when early in my practice when I didn't advocate for that, they just randomly did that. And they had never even read about it. It was just something they instinctually did because they were so undisturbed. And so, there's a lot of rhetoric going around. I'm kind of getting a little off track, but I really want to say that people understand that when you're trying to learn about home birth, you don't talk to an OB, right? Because they're going to have a completely different experience with birth than a home birth. They don't understand home birth. They don't understand physiological birth, definitely.
Mhm.
So their experience is with a completely different type of birth. And if you're not planning on having a surgical birth or a birth in the hospital, then why would you be consulting an OBGYN about home birth? People need to apply that same logic to a
Yeah.
physiological self-directed birth. We can't be going to these midwives and expecting them to know about physiology because most of them have never even seen an undisturbed birth. Just by them
Mhm.
being there, they're disturbing it, let alone the cervical exams and the Pitocin and everything that they do. So yeah, there's a lot of pushback for this Waterbirth stuff from these mainstream midwives, and I have to remind them all the time, because they ask me, well, how many births have you been to, and how many water births have you managed and stuff, and I'm like, well, I'm not a attending midwife. That's not what I do. I'm not a licensed midwife. I'm not an attending midwife. I don't go to births. What I do is completely different. The women who are birthing,
Mhm.
you know, with me in my practice are going to be experiencing things completely different than what you do. You see a lot of complications, I bet, in these areas that I don't. So it's that we need to understand that a lot of the pushback is because they don't even really understand what it is that we
Yes.
do and why we do it. They think that women can choose this because sometimes you get lucky, but they
Mhm.
really believe that they need to be there for safety because something might happen. Well, nothing just happens. Like we cause these things to happen, and sometimes we just aren't aware of it because we're ignorant, like with water birth.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
And especially a note to the community who's going to birth unattended by somebody is like we can't just look at like the research in the journals. The research in the journals comes from hospitals and attended births and from interrupted birth. It's not the same thing. So if we want to not
right.
interrupt physiology, we need to not interrupt physiology. And if you do want to do that, maybe have some monitoring and know the risks.
Yeah, and that's why using water birth studies is not appropriate when we're talking about free births and self-directed births because these are
Mhm.
all births under medical management and they were all screened low-risk women. Most of the women who free birth
Yeah.
and have a self-directed birth are not considered low risk. I was definitely not considered low risk. So there's the
Mhm.
women who have gone through wild pregnancies. They have no idea about anything to do with blood expansion or nutrition or tinctures or postpartum hemorrhage, and they're getting into a tub with their husband and thinking that everything is going to be okay. That's really, really inappropriate. And that's why we have a lot of these complications because there is a lot to know. It's not just winging it. We're not just winging it and getting lucky. It's a very intentional thing. And we have to be intentional with choosing not to relieve pain because to relieve pain is to mess with the process and it's no longer a physiological process. So, yeah. I don't know if I touched on
Yeah.
the mammalian diet
Also, when you're
reflex
looking at
before.
any of these, I think you did. I think you did.
Yep.
When you're looking at any of these, okay, where was I going to do that? Any of these studies, they're basically, so when it's like, well, the studies say it's safe. Okay, but if you read the whole study, it says it's safe if somebody is there to monitor the baby. And it's like
Right.
safe-ish, right? Like we can mitigate the things we cause by this intervention. We have the tools, right? It's like Pitocin is considered safe because, well, we have like a C-section ready for you just in case we
Right.
messed it up with the Pitocin, like just as an example, right? So if you're going to birth unattended and you're not going to have like the safety things to mitigate the harm you're causing, you need to consider
Then
that.
don't
This
cause
is a
harm.
piece like I did not know.
Yeah, and that's what I tell people. If you're gonna mess with it, if you're gonna mess up the process, then make sure you're monitored. If you're not gonna be monitored, then you need to rely on the mother. And that's something else, like you mentioned before, intuition is something you have to work on. That's something that, how do I know my baby's gonna be okay during labor? That's something that you have to foster throughout your entire pregnancy. It's an exercise that I teach women to do where you literally, as soon as you find out you're pregnant, whenever, you just go lie down by yourself in a room with your hand on your stomach and you just talk to them. And eventually it gets to where, like, when they get bigger, the more you do that, every time you go to lay down, you put your hands on them, you think about them, they start to move because you are connected
Mm-hmm.
with your nervous system. And that works in labor too. You get scared, you're worried about them. They are jammed down in your pelvis, so it's hard for them to move, but they will still make micro movements to reassure
Mm-hmm.
you that they're okay
Mm-hmm.
and that they can take another contraction. So that's something that it is. It's just people need to think about when they're birthing this different way, there's a completely different way to to do it. We're not using these things because we're not messing with it. We're not using the
Yeah.
Doppler, we're not doing cervical exams because they're not appropriate in that type of birth. So, yeah.
Okay, tell me, you touched on this a little bit, but can you talk about or like define and talk about hydrostatic pressure and its effects on like the pituitary gland and hormones of birth?
Yep. So, hydrostatic pressure and the water temperature also affects the hormones of birth too. Hydrostatic pressure is just what happens when you get into the water. We're talking about, when you're getting to a tub. Usually, if it's over the belly, if it's over the breasts, the effects are even more pronounced. So the deeper you are. The study that I'm doing, I'm finding that if women are not in the water for too long, the effects can start to take effect in about 15 minutes when you're submerged. But if you're not fully submerged, there's some women that in their stories they say that they were just kind of up to the waist or kind of sitting in the shower, that sort of thing. That is going to have a much less effect versus being fully submerged in a tub and being in there for over 2 hours. Even Michael Odent, who was very into water birth, he would not let women be in there longer than 2 hours because he knew that it
Mm.
was going to cause complications. So, uh, the hydrostatic pressure changes what your body has to do physiologically. You're having to do a completely different physiological adaptation to make up for the fluid distribution. So when you're in that water, suddenly you're having all of this fluid going centralized, and it causes your atrial valve to stretch, and it releases what's known as A&P, which is atrial natriuretic peptide, I think is how it's pronounced. And so that is what decreases vasopressin and oxytocin. Vasopressin and oxytocin are linked. You know how all these birth educators will tell you that certain hormones are linked, like melatonin is linked with oxytocin. We need things to be dark and calm and safe, similar to the things you need to fall asleep and to have an orgasm and to feel safe and comfortable. Those are the same things that we need to birth a baby successfully and safely. Well, when you're in the water and you're decreasing vasopressin, we know how dangerous that is to the baby, but it also decreases oxytocin, which is what we need for contractions. So anytime you have this type of abrupt change, your body is going to respond in one of two ways. It's either going to slow the contractions down if you're under the oxytocin threshold, which is another way of saying not progressed enough. It's a little different from the medicalized birth where, they check cervical dilation and all of that, and then they establish that you're in active labor. Um, for me, what I teach is there's an oxytocin threshold. So if the oxytocin threshold is not reached, then labor would rather stall or stop if you get into trouble. And trouble could be somebody coming into the room that your body doesn't register as safe. That can also be getting in the car to go to the hospital. You've probably heard the story a million times of things were getting so intense, we decided to go to the hospital and then everything stopped or stalled when we got there. That means the oxytocin has not reached. When the oxytocin threshold has been reached, that's when the body decides to just eject the baby quickly. So that's where you get some of the stories of when I got in the water, my contractions really intensified, or the baby was just on the rails on the way to the hospital and they were born in the parking lot, that sort of thing. That is an actual emergency ejection. That's something that you can even foster yourself when you are in a physiologically undisturbed setting, like I was with the placental abruption. So yeah. So changes to with the hydrostatic pressure and the water temperature, changes to those hormones, the vasopressin and oxytocin, can trigger that. So yeah. So that's why it's important to understand. There's one study, but I guess it was only 10 or 15 women, so that wasn't sufficient for some people that are very into water birth. They had to let me know that there was only 10 or 15 women in this study, and so I'm not going to accept it. But it was the only study that they actually tested the blood of these laboring women, and they found that it absolutely lowered vasopressin and oxytocin. So, it really, that's the only study that's kind of appropriate because all of the other studies that I've looked at, they only test outcomes in a medical setting. And a home birth can absolutely be a medical study setting as well because you have a medical midwife doing all the same things that would be done in the hospital when you're having a water birth or a birth center, right? So they're basically just saying water birth is safe because it's safer than having an epidural and Pitocin and being on your back in the hospital. We already know that, but we can't use that to dictate what we're going to do at home without anybody, right? So
it makes sense that it's interrupting the hormonal because like we know women, we talk about like not going in the water too early because it'll stop your labor, which I had that experience.
right.
Yeah. Okay. Tell me about a little bit about effects on the uterus and placenta
Yeah.
being in water.
So that mostly is going to be affected by the water temperature. So, the hydrostatic pressure isn't really going to affect the uterus in as much as just affecting the length and the effects of oxytocin. So the contraction power of the contractions, that sort of thing, and the length. But the water temperature is what really affects the uterus and the placenta. So if the water is too hot, over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to have retained placenta is more often, bleeding is more often. The uterus doesn't really like to contract down as strong and as quickly when the water is too hot, I've found. So you're going to have more bleeding. It's going to be harder to get the placenta out. More moms are fainting, that sort of thing. And the babies will be very lethargic when they're born in hot water like that. It's very difficult for them to come around, and it can actually intensify brain injuries like HIE and cerebral palsy when it comes to babies that were under distress and had hypoxia from the long labor and the lower vasopressin. So when they're born in that hot water, it just makes it even worse. Um, so then the cold water under 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and this happens a lot. I get some people that wonder, why would women birth in cold water? Well, it's just birth happens, and sometimes it takes so long. And if you don't have a heater, or if you don't have an on-demand water heater in your bathtub, the water tends to go cold. And it's hard to do anything about it because you're trying to birth a baby. A lot of women can't even physically get out of the tub. It's so hard to move when you're in that much pain and you're trying to birth a baby. And the dad's trying to do everything he can. Sometimes dads miss the birth because they're boiling pots on the stove trying to heat up the freaking birth pool. It's so ridiculous. So sometimes babies are born in cold water, and when that happens, it can shock the baby. It can cause them to gasp. It causes the uterus to clamp down often too hard, and that can make a placental abruption happen. So placental abruptions happen more often when the water is cold. It was kind of a well-known uh, tactic way back in the 1800s to put a woman in cold water, like cold river water up to the waist to get a placenta to come out. So, we're doing that in active labor. It's kind of really dangerous.
So one of the arguments I've heard for water birth is that it reduces perineal trauma. So less tearing.
Not
Have you
true.
heard that? You heard people say that?
I have heard that a lot.
Like,
Yep, I've heard that a lot, and it's not true. Because water reduces elasticity. It also wicks away any lubricant, which, as you know, as you're birthing a baby, it's like nothing but slime until the baby comes out, and it's meant to be that way. And also the hot water, if you're in warm or hot water, it increases your chances of tearing because you're causing an area that's already swollen to be hotter and more swollen. So, and we've all heard this anecdotally, right? We hear the women that were like, oh, I never tore with mine, or I tore with mine. Well, going through these studies for the SAL study that I have, the stories of women, um, I have to say, I've only gone through a few hundred entries. The tearing is off the charts for water births. There is way more tearing that is being happening with water births versus land births. So clearly.
Another thing that people say is there's this belief that water birth is an ancestral piece for us, that women have been finding bodies of water to birth in forever.
Yeah. I wrote an article actually about ancestral birthing practices because of this exact sentiment. And I've just heard such off the wall things like a really popular podcast mentioning that women have been birthing in water for millions of years. Uh, whoa, like humans haven't even been around for millions of years, so it's crazy to assume that. But yeah, the first recorded water birth was, I believe, in the 17 or 1800s in France. A lot of, indigenous communities did a lot of crazy, kooky things that were really dangerous, and, some cultures used water during birth, and they still had complications. It's also the whole image of women birthing with other women, all of the hands-on experience, all of the eyewitness experiences and accounts of these cultures where they had more hands-on practices, they had way more complications. So that's important to understand. Just because things are ancestral practices doesn't mean they're good at all. Like there's straight up crazy things in there, and we can learn and do better. And yeah, especially when we have science behind it to understand what these things are and why they happen, we can make a more informed choice now.
Hmm. It's also compelling to me to know that there aren't any land mammals that choose to go into water to birth. Like
Yeah,
nobody's taking their air breathing baby and birthing it into water unless
right.
you're a whale. Yeah.
Whales will even birth close to the surface so they can help the baby get
Mm.
up to their first breath because they're
Yeah.
still air breathing mammals.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. It's really seems intuitive and obvious once I've looked at it enough, but so fascinating because it's just such a part of our home birth cultural lexicon that water birth is like the birth you want, um,
Right.
without a lot of analysis done around it. So thanks for having this conversation, for all the work you put out on your social media. Do you want to talk a little bit about your home birth study?
Yeah, so so I'm doing a study in quotations, which is it's just like a Google Forms kind of survey format, and it's called the Stories of Women Home Birth Study. And I'm doing things a little differently to try to gain information about births at home, and that can be with a midwife, with a doula, with a birth keeper, with no one at all, with your husband, any way you want to define it. If you had a free birth, self-directed birth, birth with a midwife, birth with a medical midwife, whatever. Even if your birth ended in a transfer, we need that information, because if it was a planned home birth that you had planned and maybe it didn't end very well, or maybe it did end wonderfully, we need all that information. We want all of that, all of those stories, so that we can compile our own data, the data of just listening to the stories of women and learning from women, because we have lost so much knowledge from all of the vilification of midwives, the vilification of women, over centuries. And women are still not believed when they're in pain, when they're struggling with something. And so, we have to try to break away from this patriarchal obstetrical system, and start to go back to the wisdom of women. And that's what I'm trying to do with this study. So that way we can look at, the real effects, simply as, more tearing with water births, stuff like that. Like midwives, is there more complications when there's a midwife there or not? All of these little factors. It would be nice to just have all this information out there so that we can look at it in that format. So that's why I'm doing that study.
Okay, well, I'm going to link to your study in the show notes. And then can you just tell a little bit about how people can contact you or work with you, and what capacity they can work with you, and sort of what things you have available online or however?
Yeah, so I'm mostly on Instagram and Substack. So my name on there is Calibrated Birth. You can find me at Calibrated Birth on Instagram and on Substack. I have over like 30 to 40 different articles on Substack on various things about birth. And um, I have a stand website that I have linked on my Substack and my Instagram that lists everything that I offer. You can book a call with me. I have a self-directed birth course for parents who are planning to have their baby at home without a midwife, and it takes you through everything that you need to know about that. I also have a birth worker course that is even more information. I think it's like 16 hours of video, And the self-directed birth course is about 10 hours of educational material. And the birth worker course is to help other birth workers like myself to go out and help women virtually in the way that they need, so that we can have more of that type of support, because that's something else that's a little bit of an issue, is women who want to go down this path. Finding support for that is really difficult, because birthing at home without medical personnel doesn't mean you have to do it unsupported. So I have that. And I also have a lot of little tidbits on my website to help educate more about nutrition. I'm the goat milk lady. So I've got my free PDF that people can download on my website that they can learn all about the effects of raw goat milk and why raw cow milk should never be ingested, especially by pregnant women. And I also have a free article that a lot of women love that just talks about postpartum hemorrhage, because that is one of the biggest things, the biggest fears when women are going down this road for the first time. So that is free and available on my website as well. So, yep.
Oh, well, thanks. Thanks so much for your time today. I just really appreciate the content you share online. You share a lot of free content. Yeah. And I also appreciate that you have the course that you have. I haven't taken it, but just seeing the content that you have, a course for women who are wanting to free birth, because what's available out there popularly is not really education. So,
Nope.
It's really, right. It's just like, it's no information, right?
Yeah.
About how physiology actually works, which is not something that we've retained. It's something we're going to have to learn again. Like you said, that wisdom is not in our cultural lexicon anymore. So yeah, if we're going to birth alone, if we're going to birth outside the system, there's a lot to know, and it's knowable. Yeah. And just supportive. Thank you so much for your time, and for recording with me. And I just appreciate all the information you put out there. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for listening. Let me know what you think about this one. Comment on the episode, send me a DM. I'd love to keep this conversation going. Aubrey has this conversation through her Ask Me Anything story series on Instagram on the regular, and she generously answers all the same questions people have every time. She also has a story series saved on it if you want to check it out that way. If you have more questions that I didn't ask her, you can for sure head there, and I'm certain she will answer them directly and to the point. You can find details in the show notes on how to submit your birth story to this podcast and how to get in contact with me. Episodes currently come out whenever I have a hot minute to schedule time with a wise woman like you, but I try to get them out every other Tuesday. You can support this podcast by liking, rating, and reviewing and sharing it far and wide. This little production is my passion project, and if you'd like to financially support, you can find details in the show notes for that as well. Until next time.